Right. So if you can just mute yourself during the readings, that would be really, really helpful. Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to the July 2021 edition of Fiction Fix Online. This event is being live streamed to the Finger on the Pulse, which is the Facebook group for Fiction Fix Online, and the Zoom video will be posted afterwards on my Helen Claire Gould channel on YouTube. So please subscribe and point all your friends to it. And if you want to join the Finger on the Pulse, please request to do so. There are a few rules to review and some questions to answer, but the group is both for listeners and for readers. At our Fiction Fix live events, there's always a books table. We can't do that with Fiction Fix Online, but authors, please post your book details in the chat. And the chat you should find at the bottom of, somewhere in the middle, at the bottom of the black screen, hopefully. Okay, so if you have a website, please, this is the authors who are reading this time. Anybody who's reading next time will get a go next time. Yeah, if you have a website, do include it and a link to the ebook or seller for the print version. Prices would be helpful and an ISBN or a SIN if you have it. On Amazon Kindle, the SIN will go straight over to Amazon, hopefully, and take potential readers straight to the book. So this can be done at the end or at any time during the show when you're not reading. And I will post it with the live stream and the video or in the comments below it. Oh, Belita. Okay. Hi, Belita. Can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Oh, fabulous. All right. You're obviously joining from America.
Yes.
How did you get to hear about us?
Through Marise.
All right, lovely. Well, Marise will be very pleased to hear that you're here. Okay, I take it you just turned your video off so that you don't get recorded.
Yes.
Yes, but please, we've just been saying if you can mute yourself during the readings, but unmute when it comes to clapping at the end and clapping the new reader in. That would be great.
I will definitely do that.
Thank you so much. That's brilliant. Okay. So now please do unmute if you have already done so. And your hands are required to do some work at this point because Colin is going to start the ball rolling by bringing us up to speed with the next installment of his ongoing fantasy series. So will you please give a big hand to Colin A Brett and Mylo.
Thank you.
Okay.
This little excerpt picks up on the same night as Mylo won all that money playing dice, but it introduces a new character and introduces a little bit of an introduction to the magic and how magic works in this world. There were guttural shouts, orders perhaps, men dying, a love dying, battered and bleeding in what had been a home. The silent sobs of a young boy fading away as cold steel pierced a beating heart. The old woman was shocked to wakefulness and sat upright in bed, the pain in her back for once masked by the sensation of a knife in her heart. Good wife Agnes Bamber drew a shuddering breath and tried in vain to clear the nightmare from her mind. The memory of it was too sharp, like the knife, and Agnes choked back a sob. As her eyes grew accustomed to the darkness in her room, she noticed, as ever, the emptiness of the bed beside her. Nearly 20 years had passed since her husband had passed away, taken to the eternal sleep by a wasting disease that had nearly claimed her too. And in all that time, no other man had shared her bed, and not once had she slept anywhere other than on her side of the straw and feather stuffed mattress. Her breath clouded in front of her face. Of course, winter was drawing in, but the room was colder than it should have been, even at this time of year. "Is anyone there?" she whispered hoarsely. A breeze that was no breeze circled the room, and Agnes could follow it with her eyes as it left a trail of silver sparks over the roughly plastered walls. Then it was gone, shaking the shutters of the room's small window as it passed and vanished into the night. Agnes threw off the covers and hauled herself out of bed. Her joints creaked in protest, and pain pulsed through her knees, back, and hips. She cursed vehemently as she staggered from her bedchamber into the cottage's main room. Here at least there was a trace of warmth left from the hearth, and she could see a faint glow from the remnants of the evening's fire. Agnes knelt before the fire, more curses from the pains in her knees, and gently blew on the embers to bring the fire back to life. She added more wood and a few nuggets of coal to the flames and let the warmth soothe the pain from her bones. After a while, Agnes rose to her feet and walked stiffly to the cupboard. From this, she took a small rosewood box, its golden grain showing against the deep red of the wood. The box opened with a tiny click, and Agnes took out a silk-wrapped object about the size of her fist and set this on the table. With shaking fingers, Agnes slid the silk away and revealed a jagged shard of quartz. The firelight caught its facets and the veins which spread through the crystal, staining them a deep glowing orange. This was a small object of great value and even greater beauty. As she had been taught by her mother and her mother's mother, Agnes sought to clear her thoughts and concentrate on the crystal. Normally this would be easy for her, but after the shock of the nightmare, Agnes had great difficulty calming her thoughts enough to see into the crystal shard. What she saw was what was at once both hopeful and deeply disturbing. A boy and a girl were riding through the woods, she perched in front of him, and they seemed to be laughing and chatting happily, although she could not hear them. This was the limitation of her gift. Agnes looked more closely at the image. Storm clouds were gathering over the wood and night was falling. Snow cascaded from the skies. The girl seemed to scream and the vision shattered into 1,000 glittering fragments. She sat back, her breath short and hard. Such visions were rarely gentle on her, and Agnes had to struggle to compose herself. The boy. She recognized the boy from her vision in the crystal. Mylo Sandine. And then she knew without a doubt who had visited her in her room. There could be only one other woman who had died with a knife in her heart. Thank you.
Okay, could you please unmute yourselves?
That's brilliant.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Really enjoyed that.
Right, so
Very good.
Colin organises the technical side of this live stream, so many thanks to him for that. And please put your hands together for Colin A Brett and Mylo.
Many thanks. Thank you.
Right, so today we have 3 new readers for you and 1 returning reader, and our next reader this afternoon is Nigel, and he has several books ready to publish, and one of them is upcoming imminently. He's going to read an extract from another of his science fiction stories, so please give a warm welcome to Nigel Battley with his novel Myrise. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but
You did.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Just a quick word of warning before I start. The second chapter does have some colourful words at the beginning of it. So if this may offend you, please put your fingers in your ears for the first 2 chapters and I'll give you the thumbs up when you're clear. Okay? Right. Okay, so this is Myrise. Since forever, Myrise had been drawn to the hill overlooking the valley, stretching beyond the village in which she'd grown up. Her people having been forced off this land decades ago. Even so, Myrise would wander back every chance she had, carefully navigating her way through the gaps in the torn and twisted wire fencing, which, due to constant exposure of the harsh and ever-changing meteorological conditions, had become indolent of its responsibility to keep the likes of her out. Sometimes she'd go with friends, but mostly, like today, she'd be alone. As she climbed through the widest rip in the metallic border, She thought about how many times she'd been chased away by the miners, but couldn't choose a number she agreed with herself. Still, she'd always gotten away. Her grandmother had repeatedly warned her it was a dangerous place. Evil was there, and evil was drawn there, she'd say. She'd told Myrise how her people had once lived on the hill, how the wondrous sight of the lush valley below had been worshipped by her ancestors. The disdain in her voice could be heard each time she related the tale of how the various mining companies had forced them off the land that her forefathers had colonised. Grandmother always used the word her, not their, and Myrise considered this was a deliberate action to make it personal to herself. She would think how her grandmother must have forgotten. She already knew all this. Reaching her vantage point, again having paid no heed to her grandmother's warnings, Myrise sat behind the only bush that remained on the hill. It was her bush, and as long as she could remember, it was always covered with green, waxy type leaves, sometimes providing shade, depending on the time of the day and the position of the sun, but always providing cover from detection as she observed the men working below. As always, the valley was now dry and dusty, with trucks, diggers, bulldozers and jeeps, all being driven around with no apparent semblance of order, reminding her of ants in a nest, fetching and carrying, which to her appeared pointlessly to be moving the dirt and rocks from one place to another. However, for some time, these ants had been methodically removing her hill, burrowing underneath her. She could feel the rumble below and wondered, was it them or the very earth itself complaining of being disturbed? The once luscious valley was now like a scarred battlefield. There was no blood, but the trees, bushes and grasses were wounded, battered and bruised. Many had been buried alive, but those that remained, partially visible between the boulders and mounds of earth, were reaching for the sky. Myrise felt sadness as they appeared to be trying to cling on to life, straining to be noticed, begging to be saved. Suddenly, the monotonous noise of the moving trucks became background noise to a wailing siren. All the ants scurried away from her hill as if the Queen had given them an order, as if she herself had made them back off, repelling them in her mind from her vantage bush, just as she wished. The mechanical monsters, which some of the smaller ants had been using, stopped, making a line parallel to her hill. And those workers without the control of such monsters gathered the far side of this line, her vigil of them obscured by the new metallic barrier. The wailing continued, then a backward count filled the valley. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The wailing stopped, or maybe it was just Myrise couldn't hear it anymore over the noise of the earth separating beneath her. The loud blast of explosive charge drowned out everything. Her bush lost its grip as the earth and rocks around it rose and fell. She too was tossed into the air like dried rice on a drum that had been struck. Myrise felt herself momentarily gravitated before crashing down. On landing, she became one with the dust and shale as it slid into the void that was opening beneath her. Her bush bowed and waved to her as she slipped past it, being sucked into the earth itself, swallowed whole, the sharp granite scratching at and easily tearing her delicate skin as if 1,000 tiny teeth had been created just so the earth could devour her. Despite desperate attempts to grasp something stable, she continued to slip down, a perpetual slide on the deluge of shale, her lungs sucking in the dust as she gasped for air, her nails breaking and her dark brown skin being stripped from the muscular form below it, turning wet and red as she grappled out for anything that might slow her descent to the belly of the planet. Everything was moving. There was no hope. She was being swallowed whole. Chapter 2, Fingers in Ears. Just get the hell on with it, Carl. I want that fucking mountain in rubble before the day's out. It's a big hill, Jake, not a mountain. Click. Don't be fucking facetious with me, you... Jake's rant stopped mid-sentence when he realised Carl was no longer on the other end of the call. He slammed the receiver down onto the body of the phone, forcing it to react with a low ding in protest. He spun in his chair and looked out over the sun-blazoned skyline of Johannesburg. His office was on the 7th floor of the Anglo-American Mining Company's African headquarters, and it was fucking hot. Shit, he did not need this crap. Jake Sholdham stood and leant against the window. Even the inside of the heat-reflective glass felt hot. God damn this fucking country. Hearing his office door open and interrupting his thoughts, he turned to see the ever-pleasant face of Gloria. He watched as she negotiated the heavy door, observing her slender body, his mind removing the orange and yellow flowered patterned dress his eyes saw, imagining the dark breasts restrained beneath it. There was a clink of glass on glass as the contents of the tray she was carrying moved a little. The unintended collision due to her bottom having to hold the heavy door and thus alter her centre of balance. Reacting to the noise, he glanced from her body, his attention drawn to the contents of the tray. Acknowledging condensation on the balancing jug, his mind recognised a source of refreshment. He fixated on the jug. And I'll leave it there. It's partway through chapter 2. Thank you.
Okay, so please unmute yourself now and let's hear it again for Nigel Battley and Marise.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Okay, so now we, you might have noticed we're going through the fellas first. Ladies will get a chance later. Now we welcome one of our new readers who is also a debut author. So let's join Richie Billing in the world of his debut fantasy novel, Pariah's Lament.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Thanks for having me on. It's very nice to be here today. There's probably a few hangovers as well after that England game last night as well, no doubt. So I'd like to thank firstly Helen for having me on, because I think it's a great idea, and Helen, you organised it so well. So I think we're all very grateful for what you do. Now in March this year, my debut novel, Pariah's Lament, was released. I just wanted to share a little bit with you today. Pariah's Lament is an epic fantasy story that follows the lives of two characters, Izzy and Edvar, who were both very different, very different ends of the social spectrum, but they're both huge underdogs in their own way. And that's the kind of story I always like to read, about characters defying the odds to achieve insurmountable things. So that's what this story is about. And it's set in a nation which is in the middle of massive turmoil. And the pair of them have, little do they know, they've got the power to shape and change the future. So I just wanted to share a scene with you today. It comes from quite early on in the book, and there's just been an assassination attempt on Keeper Ashgara, who's the equivalent to a medieval king, and Edvar is his young advisor, and he's trying to uncover more information about who could be behind this assassination attempt. So it takes, in his sort of quest, it takes him to a rough and ready tavern. And I always enjoy a tavern scene in fantasy books. And I used to run an Irish pub too. And Sunday, for us anyway, was always the big drinking day. It was the most popular day for everyone going to the pub. So I thought it'd be nice to bring a bit of the pub to us here today.
Good time.
I heard it was the shade of a dragon. You believe any old hokum gob? Some toothless poppy smoker was shouting that in the market this morning. It was obviously them caravan bastards. What makes you so sure, Robbie? Did you ask the assassin yourself? Said a gruff third voice. Robbie gave no reply. Maybe he was in on it, said the voice belonging to Gob. Laughter rippled from the table behind Edvar. The three men were tanners, the least difficult of all working men to identify. Stained clothes and hands and stinking of a peculiar cocktail of rotten flesh and mint. They rubbed themselves with the latter to mask the stench of the former. Nobody could bear their presence long enough to tell them it didn't work. If it wasn't the caravans, who else would it be? Robbie spat back. I thought we'd established it was you. Seriously, Dano, you know what this means, Gob said in a solemn tone. War. They've just made peace. Why would they go to war? Dano asked. Who knows? Keepers are just as crazy as everyone else, said Robbie. If you were Keeper Tesh, I suppose it's the best time to attack. One of the first things I learned in the army was to try and take your enemy unawares. Better odds of staying alive. And that Tesh is a military man, Gob said. Stabbing men in the back is a coward's way. If you're going to fight, fight like a proper man, Robbie said. Says the man who's never fought in his life, Dano said. I had my reasons for not signing up, you know that, Robbie said, humorless. I'm twisting your balls. There's no need to get so serious all the time. We're all dying, Rob. Each sip of mead a step closer to the grave. If death is fated to come fighting for the people I love, so be it. And that includes you shriveled old prick. Edvar sipped his whiskey, stifling a smile. He revelled in the vibrant conversations he heard in the taverns and inns of Urissa. Alcohol loosened the tongue, removed the shackles of the mind, and above all, gave courage to those who lacked it. They were excellent places to glean information, but it was not the purpose of his current visit. He had a meeting, and she was late. Did you hear the story about the duel? Gob said. The keeper fighting off the assassin and sending him over his balcony, Dano asked. Robbie nodded. I heard they're still picking bits of him up. Edvard tried to keep his eyes from the front door. Constantly glancing in its direction would seem edgy, suspicious. He had to appear at ease, like one of the punters weary after a day's work. To aid the lie, he wore a disguise of second-hand clothes bought from the market in Skimar, one of Urissa's poorer districts. The scuffed woolen breeches and stained blue shirt itched so much he now knew what it felt like to be a stray dog. His battered leather boots bunched his toes together, nails digging painfully into one another. They were deliberately ill-fitting. Few people in this part of the city wore shoes that fit. Some had funny gaits from the resulting blisters and corns. But the people of this part of town were sharp. They were attentive. Nice boots stood out a mile. The door opened. Edvar's shoulders eased with the relief of recognition. Lavia stepped inside with a confident grace, at ease in her new surroundings when others would hesitate. Unlike most women in Urissa, her dyed raven black hair was cut short to her neck, revealing her dainty bear-like ears. Her round eyes, like the amber of autumn leaves, regarded Edvar for just a moment, then moved on to the next space, seeking opportunities, identifying risks. She weaved between tables, chairs, and leering men, her slender figure helping her through the slightest gaps. Edvar wouldn't lie. Whenever he saw her, he felt a pang of excitement. He locked eyes with the serving girl and signalled for 2 whiskies. Lavia slid onto the bench facing him. Good to see you, he said with a smile. Lavia shrugged, indifference in her eyes. The courtesan was in her mid-30s but looked 10 years younger. Her cheekbones high, nose straight and slight. Her pale skin was free of the lines of age, and when she smiled, her face radiated warmth enough to heat a long, cold heart. Edvar was still learning his letters when his father recruited her. You could see why. She was sharper than most lords and barons, and certainly more engaging. She had many regulars around the city, a number of whom were rich, influential men and women, the kind of people who could conspire to oust the keeper. Sad news about your keeper, she said. He was one of the better ones. He isn't dead. Not yet. You know what happens. Worse men grow jealous of better men, and in their pathetic bitterness turn to the knife. They'll finish the job, or at least try. Serving girl arrived with the whiskey. Edvard dropped a few coppers extra onto her wooden tray. A smile flashed across her mousy face, and she returned to the bar, ginger hair swinging as she went. And who are they? Lavia smiled, sipped her drink. What's your news? Edvard leaned in, hushed voice lost in the clamour of the tavern. There's a target on your back. My back? Why are you so shocked? You're the last pillar propping up the keeper. It did, of course, make sense. Edvar simply hadn't considered the reality of it happening. His initial flurry of outrage dissipated, and in its place came concern. Do you know who's ordered it? He asked. No. Edvar slumped back against the bench, shaking his head. What exactly have you heard? Because this isn't the first time I've supposedly had a target on my back. A friend of mine works down in Newcastle. She heard the crew that runs the town debating whether or not to take the contract. A contract now? Edvar's shoulders sagged as he exhaled a worried sigh. This seems serious, and right now he wasn't sure he had the fight to deal with it. Packing his things and riding as far from Urissa as possible felt preferable. I don't mean to trouble you further, but you do know you're being watched. Edvar made the turn and received a prompt kick in the shin. Are you thick as firewood? Of late, yes. There's a couple over there by the hearth. The woman can't stop looking at you. Before you get excited, it's not lust in her eyes. Lavia drained their glass and looked at him expectantly. Is that it? What about the attack on the keeper? Oh, that, she said, rolling her eyes. Heated voices erupted behind them. The unchecked laughter and chatter in the room simmered. Yeah, I am saying that. The voice belonged to Robbie. A man who can't judge his enemies isn't a man I want leading your. He was squaring up to a man a head taller, with fair hair and a wild beard that covered much of his face. You speak treasonous words, friend, the taller man said in a rumbling voice, folding his thick, defined arms. No doubt earned labouring on Eurissa's many farms. I speak what everyone else is thinking, Robbie spat. The taller man looked around the room. Nobody offered a syllable. Ashara is weak, and everyone knows it, Robbie said. We should have gone to war with Calabar, and now look, we're going to get invaded. And where is he to protect us? On his deathbed as where. We need to fight back. We're sick of war, a young man shouted from the corner. You old bastards don't have to fight, we do. Voices filled with brewing aggression rang out from all corners of the tavern. We were young once too. We've buried sons and daughters. You can't let bullies walk all over you. Exactly, Robbie said, waving his arms about. But I bet this lanky prick's never been bullied, so he can't wrap his fat head around it. The taller man stepped up to Robbie. Come on then, I've had bigger dumps than you, Robbie shouted. In a blink of an eye, the taller man swung at Robbie. The sound of fist against cheek echoed through the room. Robbie crashed into a table, hit the floor, and chaos erupted. Tankards and glasses were first into battle, indiscriminately hurled, followed by stools, swinging arms, and flailing bodies. Edvar and Lavia saw cover under their table. This is the effect of your keeper, she said, seemingly unfazed by the riot unfolding around them. He divides opinion. That wasn't Edvar's primary concern at the moment. Hurry, what news of the attack? You must have something for me, he shouted over the ruckus. Nothing. Everybody's got their own story of what happened. One thing that sticks, though, is that you got your ass kicked. Can't hide those bruises, can you? She laughed to herself. Who are they saying is behind it? That mad bastard Tesh, of course. A coin casts a large shadow. I don't suppose you've heard anyone say that. Her eyes narrowed, searching the drawers of her mind. She shook her head. What does it mean? Good question. A trio of clay cups smashed before their table, showering them with shards and ale. Men grappled drunkenly with each other. Punches aimed and missed. Stools shattered against backs, bottles against heads. How anyone who knew who was on whose side was beyond Edvar, but what did it matter to these drunken fools? In the midst of it all lay Robbie, creator of chaos, sprawled unconscious on the floor. Edvar saw a gap in the fighting. We should get out of here. Edvar and Lavia weaved through the bodies occupying the floor. Out cold, groaning, bleeding, they stepped outside into a throng of confusion and panic. People shouted for the watchman. Edvar angled away from them all. Lavia grabbed his arm. Aren't you forgetting something? She looked, unimpressed, as if she caught her cheating him. Oh, sorry, my head's up my arse. He reached into his tattered jacket, pulled out a small coin purse and slipped it into Lavia's hand. Her fingers closed around it, and she made to walk away. Edvar held on to her, pulled her back to him. If you hear anything at all, I want to know immediately. She looked into her eyes. Got it. And with that, she slipped back into the crowd. Edvar had no doubt she could handle herself. Indeed, she was probably the most dangerous person in the tavern that night. With the sounds of the brawl fading, he reflected on another fraught effort to glean information. Each door of inquiry had been slammed so hard in his face it had floored him. All he had was that stupid riddle. A coin casts a large shadow. Earlier that day, while wallowing in his room after the meeting, he dissembled every type of Urish coin, had shuttered his windows and lined them up, holding a candle to each to see which one cast the largest shadow. A silver Japara won the contest, but its shadow was hardly large. Edvar had studied every detail of the Japara, the crude portrait of Ashara and its comically pointed chin, the few words etched on the other side, loyalty, valor, victory. He picked those words apart, rearranged letters, 3 hours he would never reclaim. He had to try it though, to at least rule out the option and focus his efforts. 2 guards who had stopped him the night of the attack were on the watch of the gate. This time they saluted and one even gave a bow. Edvar reciprocated, and when he looked back, he found them squabbling. Every window in the tower was a light. No shadows for assassins to hide in. But after witnessing that brawl tonight, was the keeper safe anywhere? He loathed admitting it, but it had shaken him. Mistrust and disillusionment had spread like a plague across the city, and he wasn't quite sure how. Prior to Karabar's provocations, Ashara had been untouchable. He created jobs, kept taxes reasonable, borders safe, harvests consistent, just as fair and decisive, and above all, he kept the vault of iron secure, a perfect leader, a man who did not serve himself but his people alone. Edvard had been certain their policy of appeasement with Carabao would have garnered support. But once again, Edvard found himself fruitlessly walking to Ashara's chamber, scrambling to formulate an excuse for his failings. Thanks very much. Hope that wasn't too long.
Okay, so I do love a barroom brawl. Okay, so will you please show your appreciation for Richie Billing and Pariah's Lament?
Thanks very much, everyone. Hope you enjoy that.
Thank you ever so much, Richie. Okay, so the next person who's up is Marise, and she's in the process of self-publishing her novels as ebooks and paperbacks. So please make some noise for Marise Morland and her novel, The Songs of Cymarid 3.
Can you hear me all right? Right, this is from the prologue then. And I'll need to put my glasses on, I think. Right. Tristel was dead, and Tralvar was very, very drunk. Having failed after 3 days to attain the oblivion he craved, he left the Akron at dawn and walked unsteadily up the hill toward the Lyricon. Soon the artisans would arrive to take down Tristel's statue, which stood forlorn and isolated amid the towering colonnades. Once there had been a whole avenue of statues, each one a celebration of a living singer. Now there were no more singers. Tristel had been the last. The stonemasons appeared, duly noted Tralvar's disheveled presence, and made a show of ignoring him. Such a public display of grief was unseemly. It was no excuse that he'd loved the dead girl, because that in itself had been foolish. Tristel had attracted many lovers, all valued citizens. And what was Tralvar? Untrustworthy, a close ally of Elendis the Tyrant, and a failed musician into the bargain. Tralvar, though he kept his mind closed defensively, was well aware of their attitude. Alone in the great auditorium, he sat at a distance and watched the men begin their work. No one dared ask him to leave. Far above, other eyes had spied him. 2 women, mother and daughter, regarded him from the window of their apartment. "I'm surprised he had the nerve to show up," remarked Zenzi. Her youth and prettiness were marred by the scowl on her face and the dark shadows under her eyes. Her blonde hair was unbrushed. "Put off your anger, child," Florence said reprovingly. "It does no one any good, least of all you. Poor Tralvar's probably suffering more than we are." "Poor Tralvar," Zenzi repeated scornfully. "He's a good actor, I admit, but I'm not fooled and neither should you be. I'm convinced he had something to do with Tristel's death, and I intend to prove it." "If you're right, then Harmony help him," said Florin, still gazing at the solitary figure below. "I don't see why you feel so sorry for him." "Because I represent the Scholia, and I've always believed they've let him down. He's a born musician, better than many in the guild. If they'd allowed him to persevere, he'd have been a very different person today." As she finished speaking, a young man entered the room. He directed a reproachful look at Zenzi before picking up an embroidered wrap and hastening forward to place it round her. "You shouldn't be up, my little love," he said gently. "Edenian, it's been 5 octals since the miscarriage. All this lying around is making me tired." She glanced out of the window again. "Or maybe it's the company." "I saw him arrive," Edenian said quietly. "He won't let me read him. Should one of us go down there, Florin?" "We'll both go. Zenzi, I think you should stay here." "With pleasure. Just make sure you send him packing." Tralvar stood up as Edenian and Florin approached. They paused on the step above him, but his sombre presence was enough to offset his disadvantaged position. "My compliments, custodian," he said with a curt nod towards Florin. "Walk in harmony, first scientist," she replied. "Greetings, first poet." Travar continued, this time addressing Edenian. He makes it sound like an insult, Edenian thought, flinching very slightly as he recalled what had happened to the previous first poet. Travar had nothing to do with that, Florin reminded him. He was here with Tristel and me. Please don't feel threatened, Travar said, moving closer. He stank of liquor. I admit your new title doesn't sit easily with me, but you can blame that on your overblown verses. Now, is it true that the Scholia won't play? It's true, Florin said. They're too dispirited to form a lattice. Then they're making things worse. How much longer do you think the administrators can keep Elendis out? There has to be a concert, preferably several, and quickly. Travar, Florin said sorrowfully, you of all people should know how delicate the lattice is and how easily disrupted. A poor recital would be worse than none at all. Travar shrugged. In that case, you'd better start looking for a new home. I shall organise a concert, Edenian said suddenly, for tomorrow. And how will you command the Scholia? Travar inquired. An inspirational poem, perhaps? You've done enough damage with those already. I regret it, Edenian said candidly. Florin glanced warningly at him. I guarantee that the Scholia will play, he continued. Pardon my scepticism, but I think the task is beyond you, Travar declared. Scribble a few more odes to Elendis, my friend. Protect your livelihood. With one final insolent look at the poet, he stalked off, but Edenian knew his distress and wasn't offended. He watched until Travar had quit the main portal, then said, I shall need your help, Florin, if my plan is to go ahead. I'll organise things here. I consider it my duty, but are you sure you're ready? I'm sure. Edenian faced her resolutely. It's all happened sooner than I expected, but I've studied and prepared. If the Scholia have a singer, I know they'll play. And once they've accompanied a true voice, they'll demand more voices, and Elendis will have to give in. Ever the optimist. The attempt has to be made, Edenian said stubbornly. Think of the alternative, and then tell me I shouldn't go. Florin was silent. Admittedly, Edenian went on, Hellas is far from ideal. They have wars, they take slaves. But on the other hand, we've no record of our previous expeditions coming to harm. The journey itself is perilous, Florin said quietly. Edenian laughed. What? After Travar has personally inspected all our spacecraft? He does make mistakes. In music, perhaps. In engineering, never. Edenian's tone was emphatic. I must get a message to Helen. In fact, I'd better go to communications and see him. The Hellas flight program has to be found. Are you going to tell Zinzi what you're doing? Asked Florin. Later, promised Edenian. First, I've some serious writing to do. Writing? At a time like this? Exclaimed Florin. But Edenian didn't elaborate. Florin, ever more troubled, watched him hasten away. Her first instinct was to go after him, shake him, remind him he was not invulnerable. But in the end, she did nothing. Poets, after all, weren't renowned for their prudence. Having delivered his message, Edenian spent most of the day in the city archives, drafting a document which he eventually left there under seal. Then, at twilight, he paid his second visit to the communications center on the eastern edge of Aldermaxa. The space field was unlit, as was the custom when no traffic was expected, but off to one side, lights burned in a white tower. Helen, hopefully alone, was waiting for him. Thank you.
Right. Okay, so please let's have another round of applause for Marise Morland and the Songs of Cymarid 3. This is live now, isn't it, Marise?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so that's fabulous. All right, so now, thank you very much, everybody, for reading so far. And now we're going to welcome back Debbie who has actually been a regular Fiction Fix live reader for quite a while, and she's also read at Fiction Fix online before. So will you please welcome the return of Debbie Daley, as she reads from a novel that's been around for a little while, but it's as good a read as ever, and it's called The Dragonfliers.
Thank you. This excerpt is from my second book in the Long Ears Legacy Children's Fantasy series. And as Helen said, the book's called The Dragonfliers. And it follows a little girl called Lizzie Longton. Well, Lizzie Longton and a group of companions are on a journey through the mystical realm of elfdom to a mystery location when their party is attacked from the air by some territorials, starting with a P, and they're ancient flying creatures distantly related to dragons. The creatures are being ridden by wraiths loyal to Lizzie's arch enemy, Duke Eldorth. Chapter 12, Healing Hands. As another terrifying screech rent the air, the four young people turned their heads towards the huge black form of the territorial bearing down on them. Max screamed in terror as he was closest to the creature and urged his little horse on to greater speed. His three friends ahead of him were yelling encouragement to him as they too pressed their own mounts to go faster. The massive creature began to swoop in towards the young apprentice. Suddenly there was a series of whooshing sounds and thuds as from behind the panicking children, the two archer elves, Elgin and Elby, galloping at full speed, let off a volley of arrows. The territorial screamed, the sound reverberating through the riders below as several arrows hit the creature and it wheeled away from its prey to try and avoid further injury. Lizzie, Elrus, Eloise and Max raced for the safety of the forest, now almost within touching distance, hotly pursued by the remaining riders and Flaxen, whose goat-like legs were amazingly quick. Lizzie, who was leading the pack, turned to see what was happening behind her, just in time to watch the territorial plummet to the ground several hundred feet away, its body flipping over and over as it crashed onto the heath, throwing up dust and debris as it tumbled. She reined her horse to a stop, and Elrus and Eloise, who were tearing past her, did likewise. Max, still in his state of complete panic, continued to head towards the trees. The companions had now reached the children, and Mrs. Longton, ashen-faced and shaking, pulled her horse up close to Lizzie's own and reached across and grabbed her granddaughter's arm in relief. "My darling, are you all right?" she panted. Lizzie nodded mutely and looked past her grandmother at the stricken territorial lying in the distance. It was flapping a great wing as if struggling to get back into the air. As it did so, Lizzie watched something rise wisp-like from the creature and seemingly evaporate into nothingness. Prince Finian spoke to Elenya, who was checking that the other children were okay, whilst Philip had ridden on to catch up with Max. "Princess, we cannot stop here. There may be other territorials in the vicinity. We should make for the safety of the forest." Elenya nodded. "You're right, Finian." Then turning to the group, told them to gather themselves together and make for the trees as quickly as possible. Lizzie couldn't tear her eyes away from the injured creature that was trying to drag itself to its feet, and her eyes filled with tears. She looked at Elenya. "We can't leave it like that," she said, before she could be stopped. She had turned Whisper, her pony, in the direction of the creature and began riding towards it. "No," screamed Mrs. Longton. "Elizabeth, get back here this instant," she shouted. Then, turning to Elenya, demanded that the princess bring Lizzie back. Elenya looked at Mrs. Longton and a gentle smile crossed her lips. "I'll go with her, Mrs. Longton. Don't worry. I don't feel that she will come to any harm, but just in case." She turned to Elby and told him to come also. "You know what to do should things turn to the worst." The elf nodded. Elenya told the rest of the group to stay where they were unless there was any sign of further danger. Then they were to make haste to the forest. Elenya and Elby then rode off after Lizzie. As Lizzie drew closer to the territorial, it seemed to get more agitated and began using its wings to drag itself away from her approach. This need to escape became more urgent as Elenya and Elby caught up with Lizzie. Elenya looked down at her niece riding beside her and saw the look of compassion and determination etched upon the girl's face. She reminded the princess so much of her beloved sister that it was almost too painful to see. Elethria would take any creature that was suffering into her care and nurture it back to health. But if she was not able to save it, she would ensure that it suffered no longer. Elenya broke the silence between the three riders. What do you plan to do, Lizzie? This creature is not some tiny bird with a broken wing. Lizzie looked up at her aunt with a serious face. I know, but it's hurt and probably frightened, and it would be wrong to leave it to die in pain. I have to help it, Lizzie said, as she turned once again to see the creature flap its damaged wing. Lizzie stopped her horse. I think the horses are scaring it, she said, and clambered down from Whisper's back. Elenya and Elby followed her lead, and the three of them crept towards the territorial, leaving the horses behind them to graze. As they drew closer, Elenya placed a restraining hand upon Lizzie's arm. Wait, the princess hissed. Then she reached inside her tunic and pulled out a small silver pipe and a leather pouch from which she pulled a tiny feathered dart. You're not going to poison it, are you? Lizzie exclaimed, her eyes wide in disbelief. No, silly. The dart contains a sleeping draught. It may calm the creature sufficiently for you to approach it more safely, Elenya explained. I don't think that will work, princess. The dart is too small. Save it for another time. The voice came from the rear of Lizzie and her accomplices, and they spun round in surprise to see Flaxen with Elrus riding piggyback behind him, just behind them. As Elrus climbed down from the fawn's back, he gave Lizzie one of his cheeky lopsided grins. Well, you didn't think I'd miss out on this part of the adventure, did you? He quipped. Lizzie smiled and looked past the newcomers to see the rest of the group watching her progress, including Max, who had been returned to his companions, and Eloise sitting astride her horse next to Lizzie's grandmother. Do you have your panpipes, Flaxen? Lizzie whispered, turning to the fawn. I never go anywhere without them, princess, he assured her, removing the instrument from a leather strap that straddled his chest. The little group crept stealthily forwards towards the territorial. Once again, it struggled to get away and let out one of its blood-curdling screeches. The sound was deafening this close-up, and the little party of rescuers clamped their hands to their ears to protect them. Taking a hand from one of her ears, Lizzie held it up as a signal for the group to stop. I think there are too many of us. We're scaring the poor thing, she said. Poor thing, poor thing. It terrified the daylights out of us. It probably would have eaten us if Elby and Elgin hadn't shot it first, Elrus exclaimed. Well, it's hurt, and the thing that was riding it has disappeared, so we're the only ones that can help it now, Lizzie continued. So Flaxen, you come with me and you can play your pipes to calm it while I try to help it. I'm not sure, began Elenya, shaking her head doubtfully, but Lizzie interrupted her. I am, Elenya. I know I can help. Don't ask me how I know. I just do, Lizzie stated, as Elenya opened her mouth to protest. Elenya nodded. She was intuitive enough to know that Lizzie was speaking the truth. She had no doubt that the child had inherited some of her mother's gift for healing. Elby then spoke. It was the first time either Lizzie or Elrus had heard the elf's voice, as he and his sidekick, Elgin, usually went quietly about their business. Lizzie was surprised that he seemed to have a soft Irish burr to his voice. Now, I can't do an Irish accent, so I won't try. If you can calm the creature, princess, and keep it occupied, I can then help by removing the arrows in its damaged wing. I have a balm here in my pouch, and that will aid the wing's healing. We archers always carry the remedy as well as the cause, he explained. Thank you, Elby, Lizzie replied. Wait here until I give you the signal to join us. Come on, Flaxen, let's do this. Then, inhaling deeply, she and Flaxen crept forward once more. Just don't get too close to that beak, Elrus hissed as the friends moved away. They As they drew closer to the creature, its size almost took Lizzie's breath away. If it had looked huge when it was in the sky, it was massive close up. Territorial's long pointed head with its enormous sharp beak snapped around to look in their direction as they approached. Its black beady eyes peered at them, warning them to come no nearer. Flaxen took this as a signal to begin playing his pipes. The soft melodic notes of the tune he played began drifting across the distance between them, between the stricken creature and the pair determined to aid it. The creature leant its head to one side, as if confused by what was happening, and its eyes began to flicker and close. Flaxen continued to play, and as he did so, Lizzie began to talk to the creature in gentle, soothing words. Sorry, I lost my place. It's all right. We're here to help you, she cooed tenderly. You don't need to struggle anymore. Flaxen shot her a look, but continued to play his pipes. Lizzie smiled encouragingly. There, we'll fix everything up for you, Lizzie continued. The Territorial opened a sleepy eye and peered at her. The music was making it feel so peaceful. What was this strange little person coming so close? Finally, Lizzie and Flaxen were close enough to touch the creature. Lizzie's heart was pounding in her chest with a mixture of fear and elation at having come so close to such a magnificent but terrifying beast. Thank you.
Wow. Please put your hands together for Debbie Daley and the Dragonflyers. Okay, so now I'm going to put the session to bed with a reading from the Zardoth Imperative Clanship. And we're going to drop in on chapter 7, where last time Earth Marines Chaz and Olga and their unit boarded what they thought was the Zardothi children's ship, that's the Bekel, but it turned out to be a different Zardothi ship. Okay, oh, and before I start, just a quick reminder that the Zardothi divide their ship's days up into tenths, hundredths and thousandths. So it's very decimalised, which is probably fairly easy to get your head around. Hardy crouched in the lee of a dune, peering through an excellent pair of Zardothi binoculars at the compound in the distance. He'd landed the shuttle in the undercut lee of some dunes that clustered near the compound in the scrubby desert and had scrambled a considerable distance across them to his present position, partly to observe the compound, partly to avoid being associated with the shuttle, should it be discovered. From here, he could see people in the compound. He identified them from IR's talk as robed Declani, adult Zardothi, and even a few Kiai whose uniforms, unlike those of the guards at the compound perimeter, hung in rags on them. He was surprised at their presence. Are they renegades? Then it occurred to him, it could be spies. A new noise filled the skies and drowned out the wind that keened over the dune fields. He looked up to see a shuttle of unfamiliar design scour sand from the desert with its jets as it circled and came into land. Even at this distance from it, sand sifted over the dune apex onto him. He patted sand from his clothes, glad he'd concealed himself behind the slight rise where a new dune had formed. From this position, he'd be able to see exactly what happened when a shuttle arrived. It might provide valuable information he could use in the future, so he turned the binoculars on it. When the dust and sand had settled, the hatch opened and some Kiai troopers appeared at the top of the ramp that extended down to ground level. Tramp, tramp, tramp. No one who had ever heard military marching could mistake that sound. Hardy watched, intrigued to see the Kiai at relatively close quarters. They were as tall as the Zardothi, but more solidly built. Their black skins glistened, showing faint glimmers of cobalt bluish shading in places where the light caught the raised edges of their skin scales. Their features were heavy and fierce, and from bared knees and elbows protruded the poison spurs that Ayar had mentioned. Their cranial crests were more pronounced than those of the Zardothi, with no softening halo of hair. Formidable opponents indeed, Hardy thought. Then a group of more familiar faces passed down the ramp. Hardy recognised Ayar, closely followed by Mill, Halka, Robert, and some of the Zardothi children. They were chained by the wrist and guarded by yet more Kiai troopers. A second group consisted of the remaining children and included Davan and Jaffa. So the rescue mission to Declain had come to a sudden end. He remembered his uneasiness about it. His instincts had been right. It was a hollow satisfaction. He couldn't help but acknowledge that Ayar had also been right when he said they couldn't afford to stay hidden behind Zeret indefinitely. Nor could he afford to linger here. If they used my trajectory to work out the ship's hiding place, they'll be looking for me now. Time to go and not back to the Bakel. But I must be careful how I leave here. Another group of Kiai soldiers marched between that group and the next. Hardy's gaze fell on Josie, Edith Chaper, and Eddie and his family. He remembered Nice and wished Josie was beside him. Soon, the group of humans had passed, followed by yet more Kiai troopers. He watched with the binoculars. They grew smaller and smaller as they headed towards the compound. The first thing Mill noticed about Declain was the smell of scorched metal in the air. The hot, acrid wind almost blinded him, and by instinct he shut his eyes. Then the nearest Kiai trooper snarled something at him. "Get moving, Zardothi," his translator supplied. The trooper jerked at the chain around Mill's wrist, and he had to open his eyes to see where he was going. He wasn't fast enough to avoid a shove in the small of the back from the trooper and staggered a little, but he quickly regained his balance and marched with all the others, though he could see they were suffering as he was. Ahead, the three human women and Lucy coughed fit to split their lungs. Edith's hands were at her throat where the translator had been so recently implanted. A great metal construction loomed over them, and Mill had no difficulty in identifying it as the smelting works. Choking black smoke belched out into the atmosphere in a plume many kilometres high. Surely that must be the source of the stink. But they were marching towards the compound where many people stood, sat or lay, listless in the sweltering heat as they watched them. Sweat stung Mill's eyes. He wiped it from them with his free hand, but kept up with the adults. Lucy's image blurred in front of him as she stumbled again. Abruptly, he understood the wisdom of his people's use of the long sleep for children, harsh as it had previously seemed from his own perspective. At least I might see my parents again, if they're here. Hope leapt as he tried to look at his surroundings, sure that Ayar would do the same. The troopers clustered around the compound gates ahead, then swung them open and pushed Ayar inside. As each prisoner followed, they gave them a little shove until everyone was behind the gates. Then one trooper followed them in and came along with a key to unlock the chains. Freed, Mill rubbed at his wrists, which were just one more misery in the huge one that enfolded his whole body. But he went to stand beside Lucy and put his hand on her shoulder. "Try to breathe through your nose," he said. "You won't cough so much." Lucy nodded to show that she'd understood, but couldn't speak. But she must have followed his advice, because bit by bit the coughing eased. Mill felt huge sympathy for her. Her eyes streamed, and as he wiped moisture from his own cheeks, he realised what it must be like for humans to cry. Red Hempel waited, hardly daring to breathe, as the Zardothi commander spoke with someone. In the background, she heard him say, "Are you certain?" She couldn't hear the reply. Then the commander spoke to her again. "Well, this rather puts a different complexion on it then." He paused, then finally added, I've just been informed that the Bekel has been boarded. It may be in both our interests to temporarily join forces. Where is the Bekel? In orbit around Declane. Ki troops are on board. The Zardothi commander paused again. I should warn you, one clan ship would never simply hand over to another clan to a third party, but I would be willing to fight with you against the Voth. We've come here from the Havertal system to fight them and would have joined forces with other ships already here, including the Bekel. Some other clan ships stayed behind to prevent the Voth from totally stripping Havertal of its resources. And I should warn you that their next target is likely to be your high-tech, mineral-rich system, which they can reach from Havertal. IR told us they'd be coming to Earth at some point, Red Hempel admitted. I would be interested to join forces with you, especially if the Earth's future is at stake. Now, how about trading names and information, and my Marines, of course, in exchange for our cooperation with you? If the Bekel is in enemy hands, my mission can wait until we're in a position to recapture it. All right, he nodded. I'm Vagar Hesdats, commander of the Khazid, leader of Clan Khazid. Red Hempel, JSEP fleet commander and captain of the Endeavour II. The other two ships with us are the Beagle Star and the Magellan's Mission. If we're going to cooperate, we'll have to lay down some ground rules. We should use your laser comms out here. We think the Voth have hyperspace communications capability. And if you're to successfully fight alongside us, you'll need to follow our instructions. It's no good charging in to meet the Voth head on. They would crush you. We fight a war of stealth. Generally, we win too. Red Hempel was silent as she considered for a moment what she'd let herself in for. It would be like surrendering command of her own ship. Now, just a minute, she said. I'm not sure I want to follow your instructions. I'm used to giving my own orders. Fine, then we'll keep your troops. You can go back to Earth and tell your superiors you failed to get the Bekel and her crew back, and that the Voth will head to Earth when they've finished with Declane and Havertal. I've been outmaneuvered, Red Hempel thought. There's no way I'm going home empty-handed. All right, she said, have it your way, but I want my Marines back within the half hour. How long is that? Vagar asked. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. So, yes, I hope you enjoyed that. And many thanks to all our lovely authors and readers. Well read, everybody. That's Nigel, Richie, Marise and Debbie for joining Colin and myself. And thank you so much to our lovely friends and family, studio audience, for joining us and supporting our readers today. And if you'd like to stay and join our chat with the authors afterwards, after we finish, you are most welcome to join us.
Very much. Thank you.
Authors, please don't forget to include your links to your books on Kindle, etc. in the chat, and or send them to me afterwards, and I'll post them on my timeline and on my website, www.zardoth.com. Do include prices, ISBNs or ASINs, where to get them, and your websites as well. And the ASIN should take readers directly to that book. This has been Helen Claire Gould, comparing Fiction Fix Online and bringing both new and established writers in various fiction genres to your attention. Thank you so much for joining us. The next Fiction Fix Online, if I can say it right, is on Sunday the 1st of August at 4 p.m. till 5:10 p.m. And I look forward to catching up with you then. And the next Poetry Sandwich, which is my personal live stream, is back on Tuesday, the 10th of August. I'm really, really hoping that I've recovered enough from my broken leg to be able to stand up for half an hour then. I think I will be okay. So watch out for the poster and do please try to join me. Bye for now.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Okay,
Well
Cheers, everyone.
thank you very much. Stop recording.
Well done, everybody. That was good.